Morning, everybody. I have to say, I love that I'm following Ebony and that you've all just done a mindfulness exercise, because it means you're really focused and hopefully with me for this, because we are going to get pretty deep. All right, so let me go to my first slide here. Oh, okay. Well, there was a slide before that said, Chapter 1, Why Loneliness? So, oh, there it is, okay. Why loneliness? I kind of came to this in an interesting way, and it was actually through health. So I was working in DC with the now former Surgeon General, and we'd been doing a lot of work around opioids and addiction. And one of the things that came up over and over again when we sort of had these pull-asides with patients who were in treatment was that the stories were never about the initial pain, the back pain, or the physical pain that they experienced that had gotten them prescription for opioids. It actually had to do with a sense of isolation and loneliness and heartbreak. Going back to the slides, one thing that Vivek says, he says that during my years caring for patients, the most common pathology I saw was not heart disease or diabetes, it was loneliness. People would come into the emergency room and they would have something broken, they would have a heart issue, but the thing that was always there accompanying it was this sense of isolation. People coming in alone and then being sent back into the world alone. So the thing that's really interesting is that we're living in a sort of paradoxical moment. We live in the most technologically connected age ever. You guys all have smartphones likely. Yet we find ourselves increasingly lonely, right? Oops. And why is that, right? We have these tools, we have these different platforms, whether it's Facebook or the latest thing that's coming out, that's meant to connect us. And yet at the same time, we're living in this time where people are just feeling really isolated. So what does that look like statistically? So loneliness is on the rise. In the 1980s, there was a study that showed that adults who self-reported loneliness, 20% of them said that they felt lonely. And today, it's now 40%, right? There are studies done all over the world. There was a study done recently in the UK that said that half of older adults there actually feel intensely lonely at least at one moment in their life every day. And here's the other thing that's really interesting, is that loneliness is actually bad for your health. There are biological ways in which loneliness manifests in our organs, in the way that our body functions, that wreaks havoc on the body. So let's talk about some of those ways. A weakened immune system. It actually can affect the rate at which white blood cells are actually created in your body. Disrupted sleep patterns, right, which has a whole host of other things that it creates as a result. For older adults, accelerated cognitive decline, right? So this is memory, this is the ability to decision make. Greater risk of depression and anxiety, right? This is, how many folks here, I'm just curious actually, is depression and anxiety something that you guys talk about at school? Does it come up? I'd be curious to see, show of hands. Yeah? No? Okay, a range. There's also inflammation that results in the body. There's stress hormones that increase and overstimulate the stress response, right? And so that also thereby increases the risk of heart disease and stroke. And finally, it also impairs task performance. And something that's really important to me and to all of you is creativity, like the ability to do school well or the ability to work well. This is the one that's really staggering to me that I always remember. Loneliness, like deep chronic loneliness, is as damaging as this. Smoking 15 cigarettes every day, right? It actually is worse than that. And I don't know what the stat is for e-cigarettes, but I will say that e-cigarettes also will likely also go in this category because it's a tobacco product. So it's something that can really, really harm us and actually reduce our lifespan. So how much in our lifespan? So research has shown that the increased likelihood of death was 26% for reported loneliness, so people self-reporting a sense of isolation. 29% for social isolation. So that means like actually not having enough social connections, not belonging to different social groups, not actually being connected, and 32% for living alone. So the latter two are what are called objective measures, right? So things that you can count, that you can objectively look and say, and the former one is subjective. So this is based on how people feel. So I could have, 5,000 friends on Facebook and 50 friends at school, yet still feel really lonely. Somebody else could have a really close-knit group of, say, like even one or two, three friends that they hang out with, and they don't experience loneliness. So it really is different per person. Let's look at what this means for younger people. So socially isolated children have significantly poorer health 20 years later, even after controlling for other factors, right? And research has shown too that adolescents and young adults, and then also people who are older, so likely more like retirees, those are times in our life where actually loneliness peaks, right? So I'm looking at you guys because you guys are in that, you guys are among that age group, right? There's also this question about what about technology? So there was actually a study done about technology, and it showed that heavy users of social media, so people who go online on social media more than 58 times per week, are 3 times more likely to feel lonely than people who are light users. And so they define light users as 9 times per week, right? The thing that we haven't figured out is we've created this amazing technology, but we haven't figured out how to use it. So I'm dropping some seeds here in terms of some ideas of what you guys can do if you choose this challenge. Another interesting aspect of loneliness is that it can be contagious, right? They've also shown the converse side, which is actually if you are happy, that actually could also be contagious. The way it works with loneliness, though, let's say in your network, let's say you have a family member who's feeling lonely, right? They pull away. As a result, because this is a two-way street, you then are more likely to feel lonely, 52%. They did a study in Massachusetts, actually, in a community there looking at that. And so what this tells me is that we're all in it together, right? So it's not just solving for the person who maybe is the loner at school, but that that our loneliness and our happiness is actually interconnected with everybody else's. Okay. And if you zoom out a little bit, this is something that I've been thinking a lot about recently. That not having connections is sort of happening in this fraying of community. It's about being left out. It's about not having a sense of belonging. It's about social exclusion. It's about polarization, right? So we might say, like, we might look at our daily lives and look at sort of the quality and the range of connections that we have. But what's at stake here is actually something that, as you zoom out, is actually incredibly significant, right? And to me, I actually think of this as a kind of patriotic cause, right? So that for the future of, for your schools, your communities, these tables, all the way out to thinking about the future of our country and really the world, that loneliness is something that we really need to address, and we need to do it now. And along these lines, I think this is the other thing that I've been thinking a lot about as well, is that isolation is something that we can actually inflict on one another, right? So if I think about, there's been a ton of conversation around bullying and what to do about that, or the way that we isolate people, the way that we set up systems that isolate people, so people coming out of incarceration, for instance, or people who are immigrants, right? Actually, Gabby's story about DACA, that's a really interesting way in which we use isolation to otherize people and sort of keep others at bay, right? So this is actually a tool of actually fraying and dividing our society writ large. So loneliness is important, and it's connected to everything that we care about, right? So whether it's about creativity, it's about doing well in school, it's about addiction, all of that is connected to isolation. So let's get a little bit happier, and I'm gonna flip to thinking about connection. So chapter 2, connection is incredibly powerful, right? The challenge here is not actually just to solve for loneliness, like to make somebody feel less lonely or kind of get rid of a lonely feeling. It's actually about cultivating connection and thinking about all that's possible from that. So looking again biologically, humans are actually wired for connection, right? So back in the caveman days, we needed to be able to cooperate with each other in order to build trust and relationships so that we could secure food, that we could protect each other, right? And this is actually built into our wiring. And same today, you can't do things in isolation, right? I mean, even when I think about my work as a designer, the idea of the lonely creative genius is actually just a myth. Like the work that's done that's well is actually done as a team. Okay, and what are the ways that science shows us that connection is good for our health? Well, a lot of things. So it actually protects our brains. It's a sort of protective layer in the same way that actually mindfulness does for the body as well. It makes you more resilient to stress. There's a reduction in the risk of mortality, better cancer survival rates. It makes you more resistant to the effects of chronic stress. It lowers your heart rate and blood pressure. It strengthens your immune system. and it triggers the release of stress-reducing hormones. So all in all, connection, feeling connected to people, is actually something that's important, that's a health contributor and actually builds resilience in your bodies. So one of my favorite examples, this is just a few screen grabs from a video. This is, I actually learned about this work through Aspen. There's a doctor in South Carolina who is an OB-GYN, right? And what she noticed was that there were a high number of women, particularly minority women, African American, Latina women, who, as pregnant women, were more likely to give birth to preterm babies, right? So babies who are not essentially fully at 40 weeks. And that actually introduces a whole host of problems. It can mean cognitive development impairments. It means being behind in education, employment, et cetera. It can last your entire life. So if you can sort of address this up front, you can imagine the impact that you're making over people's lives. What she figured out was that there's this method called centering. So they pull together groups of, say, 8 to 10 women who are pregnant. They come in for their checkups, and they sit together literally in a circle like this, talking about their experiences, right? They then give birth, and they come back, and they still have a support group, a network, essentially, that they work with. And what they found was that they were actually able to reduce preterm births from 12% to 8%, right? So you can imagine, too, the savings in terms of healthcare costs as well, right? So if you can invest up front in this way, in a natural way, which is that we are built to connect socially, that this can have tremendous effects, not just for the mom, but also for the babies and the siblings and so forth. So, we might be thinking well, what is connection, right? What we want to do is actually help cultivate meaningful connection. So that means some breadth of connection, so everything from having a best friend to being able to say hi to somebody at the bus stop, or having the sense of community, and quality connections, not just about quantity. It's actually not about quantity, because it's, like I said, it differs for everybody, right? So it's really about how do we create ways for people to connect really meaningfully, not in sort of surface ways that actually lead to the sense of being known and being understood. I'm curious, have any of you come across this topic before? Have you guys read anything? Has it come up in your social feeds or anything like that? One person, okay. So it's something that is coming out more and more. And these are just some examples of things that I've come across, actually. And I will say the UK is actually really far ahead in terms of their addressing the issues. But they have, can you get the slide back up? They have a campaign to end loneliness. They have, there's a story, actually, the young woman in the lower left corner, she made an app, actually, she'd been bullied at school and moved to different schools, so she made an app. So if you're new at the school, you don't know where to sit, you'd actually know based on the app where you could sit, right? So this is using technology in a way to drive towards real connection. There's a student to the lower right corner there, Dennis, who is a student in Florida, who, Haitian immigrant who had felt isolated, and he quit his high school football team to really sort of push forward this club, which is No One Dines Alone, right? So this idea of really reaching out to people, so that's him reaching out to a student there. Casserole up there, that's actually something one of my colleagues started in the UK. So basically, for older people who are unable to cook for themselves, somebody volunteers to cook, they make extra, they bring it over to the neighbor, have a conversation. It's a kind of meaningful way to bring people together, and you're actually providing a kind of service. A lot of these actually have to do with food. On the upper right, in the UK, they actually set up a hotline, right? It's called the Silver Line. So people will call in if they're feeling lonely, but they're not just talking about feeling lonely, they're just talking about stuff, right? Just knowing that there's somebody out there willing to listen and connect is incredibly powerful. And then the cow, you might be thinking about well, why is there a cow on the screen? So it turns out there's actually research that shows that if cows have best friends. If you actually separate them, they have a similar response of being stressed out when they're separated from another cow that they feel very socially connected to. So I love that this conversation is happening. It's happening with you guys, and I love that people are actually doing something about it and not just talking about it. So the stakes are high. We are living in an era that I think is increasingly defined by isolation, right? We see it in our politics, we feel it in our communities. I see it certainly as a person of color. I feel it. I think this challenge is really important, and I feel like we're at a pivot point. Either we can address this, right, and do something about it, or we don't, and things just keep fraying and breaking, and people aren't able to even have a conversation with each other, right? That's the point that we're at now as a country. So my challenge to you is to use your power to heal the loneliness and isolation that weakens the health and well-being of our communities, but by designing ways to strengthen meaningful connections between individuals. And I highlight the power to heal. This is actually something that Dr. Murthy talks a lot about as well, which is that you don't have to be a medical doctor to help heal somebody. This is an innate ability that we have as humans to be able to heal one another through connection, okay? So, final notes, right? Just things to keep in mind that should you choose this challenge to consider as you go about designing solutions to this. So, from my perspective, loneliness is quiet, and it can be invisible, and it's incredibly stigmatizing. Even talking about it can be hard, right? That means that you actually have to take extra care in designing those solutions, right? Think about ways in which you can engage people in conversations, whether verbal or nonverbal. I mean, there are a whole host of ways you can do it. I actually think the Me Too movement and talking about sexual harassment is a really good analog to this. And in many ways, actually, the reason why that has persisted sort of underground for so long is because nobody wanted to talk publicly about it. And people relied on the isolation of the people who had been assaulted as a way to keep quiet. Let's see, let's go forward one. Oops. Okay, so in design, one of the things that we do is we frame things as a question, and it's intentionally how might we. It's not can we, it's not should we, it's how, because you want to come up with a breadth of ideas around this. Same with might, right? It's not could, it's not should, it's might. These are anything that could be possible, anything that comes out of your imagination. And the we is about you guys as a collective. So some how might we's to consider as you think about this challenge. So one is how might we destigmatize talking about loneliness, right? Again, I sort of said, like, this is a hard thing to talk about. So what are some other ways? Maybe people use different words. Maybe people communicate in different ways. It's not just face-to-face conversation. How might we make it easier for people to break the ice? That could be one thing. Sometimes it can be really awkward to try to connect, right? So this is a kind of interesting challenge, human to human, of how you can actually design ways to connect with people. And three is, how might we create ways for two people to get to know each other in more meaningful ways? What are some of those ways, right? I'll give you a really simple example. When I was working in DC, we had it was the most diverse team I've ever worked with. There were people who were from the military side, I was from the civilian side, people who understood hierarchy, people who didn't. And one of the simple things that we did at our weekly team meeting is that we had 5 minutes to do something called the Inside Scoop. 5 minutes, we would sort of have a surprise presenter each week, and they would tell their story, right? I learned some crazy things about my colleagues I would have never imagined, especially for the ones who were in uniform, that people had climbed Mount Fuji, that somebody else was like in a motorcycle club, like all this stuff that you don't anticipate to discover, but if you take the time to have a conversation with somebody, it could actually reveal. And just last thing. So when you go about doing something creative, I think it's really helpful to have values, right? This is, at IDEO, we have something called the Little Red Book, and it is our book of values. These are two of them. One is learn from failure, and another is make others successful. So as I think about you guys and the challenge that you have going forward, I have a couple thoughts of some values you could hopefully embrace as a team. So one is starting with humans and building empathy. Two is getting creative about the ways that you engage, right? Like, you get different materials, prototype some of these interactions, like practice amongst yourselves. I mean, do you guys all know each other, or are you guys sort of new to each other? Kinda? Okay, so there's some getting to know you that needs to happen on your teams to really be solid as a team. Definitely be optimistic and aspirational. Don't kill something because you feel like it's not possible, right? There's something to be learned from that idea, even if it's like gonna take millions of dollars to pull it off. That doesn't mean that it's something that you should kill. So aim high, in other words. The fourth is to prototype and iterate alongside people, right? What I don't want for you to do is like sort of go into a room and sort of think through the problem intellectually. You actually need to go out into the community, whatever community you choose to be sort of your audience or your target for your design, and actually design alongside them, right? And then finally, to aim for simplicity and elegance, right? A design solution to this it should not be too complicated. It shouldn't take more than 200 words to explain like how it works. Like, it should be intuitive, it should be elegant, and it should be very simple. So with that, I urge you all to go forth and connect. So thank you.